There are moments that history quietly buries, not because they didn't happen, but because the people at the center of them made a choice to stay silent, to keep it locked away, to carry it alone rather than let the world pick it apart. And sometimes that silence becomes its own kind of answer, louder in many ways than anything spoken out loud. For decades, two names sat at the very top of the action world. Two men who didn't just make movies, they became something larger than movies. They became symbols of discipline, of toughness, of a certain unbreakable pride that felt almost mythological to the people watching from theater seats. Chuck Norris, Jean-Claude Van Damme, you couldn't say one name without the other one surfacing. The comparisons followed them everywhere: magazines, late-night talk shows, arguments in school hallways between kids who had never thrown a single punch in their lives. Who was tougher? Who was the real deal? Who actually deserved to sit at the top? But nobody ever stopped to ask the question that actually mattered. What did they think of each other, not the rehearsed version? Not the smile for the camera answer, the real one, the thought that lived deep behind the eyes that never quite made it to the microphone. Van Damme guarded that answer for a long time. He was careful in the way that men who have been burned learn to be careful. He understood the industry. He understood what honesty could cost you, but something changed. Slowly, quietly, across a handful of rare and unscripted conversations, he started to open up. Not performing anymore, just talking. And what came out when he spoke about Chuck Norris, it didn't land the way most people expected. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't a rivalry finally exploding into the open. It was something far harder to look away from. It was the truth. And it was the kind of truth that carries weight because it clearly cost him something to say it. To really understand what Van Damme revealed, you have to start at the beginning, not the Hollywood beginning, the real one. Because nothing he said in those later years makes complete sense without the full picture of the life that shaped him. Jean-Claude Camille François van Varenberg came into the world in 1960 in a quiet municipality just outside Brussels, Belgium. His father worked as an accountant. His mother kept the home. On the surface, it was an ordinary life, the kind that doesn't produce legends. Except Jean-Claude wasn't a strong child. He was weak by his own telling, pigeon-toed. He walked differently and children noticed, the way children always notice the thing that makes someone stand out. Not always kindly. His father saw something in him though. Something the boy couldn't yet see in himself. And so, at 11 years old, he was enrolled in karate lessons. It wasn't dramatic. There was no grand moment of destiny. Just a father making a quiet decision, hoping it would give his son something solid to stand on. What the son built from that decision was something else entirely. By 16, Van Damme held a black belt. By 18, he was the European middleweight full-contact karate champion. He trained with an obsession that bordered on consuming karate, ballet, weight training, disciplines that had no business being combined. Woven together into something that moved with a kind of breathtaking precision nobody had quite seen before. Then he did what dreamers do. He packed almost nothing and moved to Los Angeles. A few $100s in his pocket depending on which interview you're listening to, limited English, no connections. No guarantee of anything. He waited. He knocked on doors. He got told no more times than he could count. He slept in circumstances he would later describe without glamour. He did all of it, kept doing it, because he had seen something in himself that he needed the world to see too. And eventually it did. Bloodsport arrived in 1988 and it changed everything. The film had sat collecting dust on a shelf for over a year before anyone released it. Nobody expected much, but audiences saw Van Damme move and something electric passed through the room. The splits, the spinning kicks, the raw physicality that felt almost reckless in its commitment. People hadn't seen a body do what his did, not like that, not with that kind of control mixed with wildness. He became a star. Almost overnight his name meant something. And it was precisely at that moment, standing in the new light of real recognition, that the comparisons to Chuck Norris began in earnest. Chuck Norris wasn't waiting in the wings when Van Damme arrived. He was already a legend, already an institution. A man whose name had been carved so deep into American popular culture that it felt less like a career and more like a permanent feature of the landscape. Carlos Ray Norris was born in 1940 in Ryan, Oklahoma. He grew up poor in a home fractured by absence, a father who wasn't there in the ways that matter, a mother who held everything together with quiet, relentless strength. As a child, he was unremarkable by his own account. Not loud, not confident, not the kind of boy anyone would have looked at and predicted greatness. The military reached him first. He served in the United States Air Force and was stationed in South Korea, where he encountered Tang Soo-do for the first time. That moment redirected everything. He came home a different man, focused, driven, carrying a discipline that had found its proper home. He trained, he competed. He built a martial arts career of rare distinction before a single film camera ever pointed at him. When the acting came, it came slowly at first. But by the late 1970s and straight through the 1980s, Norris had become something that transcended the movie screen. Missing in Action, Code of Silence, Delta Force. Each film fed an audience that was hungry for a very specific kind of hero, quiet, morally certain, dangerous in the way that felt righteous rather than reckless. He wasn't just a character. He was a reflection of something his audience wanted to believe about strength and justice. He became a cultural symbol, a fixture. The kind of figure that doesn't belong to Hollywood alone. He belonged to a whole generation's idea of what a man should look like under pressure. So when Van Damme stepped onto that same stage, Belgian accent, extraordinary flexibility, spinning kicks that nobody else was doing, the entertainment press did exactly what it always does. It reached for comparison. It put them side by side. Who is more dangerous? Who is more skilled? Who walks away from the fight? In interviews, Van Damme was measured. He praised Norris. He was careful, calculated even, in the way that someone learns to be careful when they understand what carelessness can cost. He was smart enough to know that openly challenging a man of Norris's standing would only make him look smaller. But that careful public posture wasn't the whole truth. Those who worked alongside Van Damme in those years have described something deeper beneath the professional respect. A complexity. A feeling that went beyond admiration into territory that was harder to name. And for a long time, that feeling stayed buried under the polished surface of press junket language and practice smiles. It would take the slow passage of decades before it finally came out. The 1990s from the outside looked like everything Van Damme had been working toward. Timecap in 1994 became one of the highest-grossing independent films of that year. Universal Soldier, Hard Target, Sudden Death. His name on a poster meant ticket sales. Studios wanted him. He was, by any measurable standard, at the peak of the thing he had spent his entire adult life building. But beneath the surface, the foundation was cracking in ways the posters didn't show. He has spoken about this period with an honesty that is, frankly, uncomfortable in the best possible way. The struggles with cocaine, the prescription medication that followed. The feeling, quietly devastating, when you really sit with it, of performing at the highest possible level while privately coming apart. Of having everything the industry tells you to want and still feeling something essential slipping away. The marriages that fractured, the legal troubles. The physical toll of years doing work that punishes the body in ways that don't show up in the final cut. The exhaustion of maintaining an image that had grown so large it had become its own kind of cage. And through all of it, that shadow remained. That point of comparison that never quite went away. Chuck Norris had come to represent something for Van Damme in those years. Something he couldn't fully articulate at the time, but seemed to measure himself against in quiet, private moments. Not out of hatred, according to people who knew him well, but out of something more exposed than that, a need to be taken seriously, to be seen as more than just an athletic spectacle. To belong in some real sense to the industry he had given everything to. The difficulty was that Norris had something Van Damme never quite reached in the same way. He had American roots. American mythology woven through everything he did. His audience didn't just watch him, they saw themselves in him. They claimed him as their own. Van Damme was always somehow the outsider. The foreigner with the accent and the acrobatics. Celebrated, yes, but celebrated at a slight distance, like something impressive and foreign rather than something deeply familiar. That distinction, quiet as it might seem from the outside, left real marks. And when Van Damme finally began speaking honestly, you could hear every one of those marks in the way he chose his words. The interviews didn't come all at once. That's important to understand. There was no single explosive confession, no viral moment where everything collapsed into the open in one breathless rush. It was slower than that, more honest in a way because of the slowness, a door opening an inch at a time. More light with each conversation, until eventually there was enough of it to see clearly what was inside. Across various interviews and conversations over the years, Van Damme spoke about Norris with a layered, almost uncomfortable honesty. The kind that doesn't feel rehearsed because it clearly wasn't. You could see it in the way he hesitated before certain sentences. The way his eyes carried something before the words arrived. He acknowledged Norris's discipline directly, the longevity. The career that had stretched across decades without the kind of public unraveling that had marked Van Damme's own story. He spoke about what it meant to watch someone maintain not just a career, but an entire image, unbroken, intact, while his own narrative had included falls that played out in full view of everyone. And then he went further than that. He talked about what it genuinely felt like to be compared to someone whose success had such different foundations. Norris had a cultural ownership that Van Damme could not reach no matter how hard he trained or how perfectly he landed a kick. His persona was stitched into the fabric of something Van Damme could observe but never fully enter. What struck people who heard Van Damme say these things was that he wasn't bitter. He wasn't angry. He had moved through those feelings, or perhaps just lived long enough and hard enough to come out the other side of them. What remained was something quieter. A clear-eyed understanding of how things actually were, stripped of the defensiveness that had once surrounded them. He also said something that very few people had been waiting to hear, because very few people had thought to expect it. He said he genuinely admired Chuck Norris. Not in the polished, camera-ready way, the other kind. The quiet, almost reluctant kind that one serious person reserves for another when all the competition has finally burned away. He talked about Norris as someone who had grasped something about survival that Van Damme had taken far longer to learn, that the industry doesn't reward the best kick. It rewards the person who knows who they are and stays there. Coming from Van Damme, a man who had spent years being a slightly different version of himself depending on who was in the room, that observation carried a weight that was hard to shake. What makes this story worth sitting with is not the surface-level detail of two action stars finally exchanging honest words. It's what those words reveal about both men and about the particular world that shaped them. The action cinema of the 1980s and early 1990s was constructed on a very specific idea of what a man was supposed to be: unbreakable, silent about pain. Never uncertain, never doubtful, never caught in a moment of visible human weakness. It was a performance of invincibility, and both Norris and Van Damme didn't just participate in that performance. They helped build it, they gave it its most recognizable face, but they lived inside it very differently. Norris held the structure. Whatever was happening privately, and every human life carries its private storms, the public image stayed intact. Consistent, the wall never visibly cracked. His audience got exactly what they had always gotten, right through to the quieter years of his later career. Van Damme's wall came down, not as a decision, not at first. The personal difficulties simply grew too large to contain behind the image. The substance struggles became public. The relationship breakdowns became tabloid material. The cracks appeared in real time, in front of an audience that had only ever been invited to see the polished version. And here is the thing about that, the thing that makes Van Damme's story genuinely moving when you look at it with clear eyes. The falling gave him something the intact image never could have. It gave him perspective, real perspective, the kind that doesn't come from success but from survival. When he sat down in those later interviews and talked about Norris, he wasn't speaking from a place of rivalry or wounded pride. He was speaking as someone who had been through the fire and come back with something to say about it. What he revealed about Norris was also, in a way, a revelation about himself. A recognition of two different paths through the same impossible terrain. One path kept the walls standing, the other let them fall and discovered what remained underneath. That is not a small distinction. For a man who had performed toughness for decades, finding the courage to speak plainly about complexity, about longing and inadequacy and the slow, difficult work of self-understanding required something real. The years keep moving, as they always do, and the world that built these two men has changed beyond recognition. The lone action hero, one face, one body, one unmistakable presence carrying an entire film, has been largely displaced by franchise machinery and effects-driven spectacle. The personal physicality that made Van Damme and Norris magnetic feels, in the current landscape, like something from a different civilization, which, in a sense, it is. And yet both men are still here. Norris, now in his 80s, has stepped away from most of the public eye. Health challenges, some reported, others kept carefully private, have marked these years. The image that once felt permanently fixed has softened in the way that all things soften with time. The invincibility was always partly myth, and the myth has aged the way myths do when the people behind them become simply human again. Van Damme, now in his 60s, has kept moving. He made JCVD in 2008, a film that genuinely stopped critics in their tracks by doing something almost no action star of his standing had dared to do. He played himself, not the icon, not the legend. A man named Jean-Claude Van Damme, struggling visibly with the distance between the image the world had of him and the reality of his life. It was raw in the way that only true honesty can be raw. It worked because nothing in it was manufactured. That honesty has become the most consistent thing about him now. The man who once performed indestructibility for a living has spent his later years talking openly about mental health, about the real cost of the persona he built and maintained, about what was taken from him by the years of impossible pressure and what he had to slowly, quietly rebuild. He speaks as someone who has earned his self-knowledge the hardest possible way. When he talks about Norris in this period of his life, there is something in it that has moved past comparison entirely. It sounds like respect that has been tempered by real experience. The kind that only becomes available once you have stopped pretending to your audience and to yourself. He has said, in the way that people say things when they have finally arrived somewhere after a very long journey, that he understands now what he could not have understood then. That every man in that world was carrying something. That the image of indestructibility they all performed had a price, for everyone, whether the evidence showed on the surface or stayed buried beneath it. That is the heart of what he revealed. Not a scandal, not a betrayal, not an old wound reopened for attention, something quieter, two men, the same arena, different silences, and finally one of them willing to speak. There is something that happens when you watch the giants of any era grow older, something it takes a moment to name. It's a kind of reckoning, not just with them, with ourselves. With what we needed them to be and why we needed it. We put people like Chuck Norris and Jean-Claude Van Damme on pedestals that were never built to hold a real human being. We wanted them frozen, exactly as they appeared in their best moment, invincible, untouchable, immune to the ordinary weight of a human life. We didn't want to hear about the cost. About bodies broken gradually by years of real physical punishment. About the particular loneliness that seems to exist inside certain kinds of great fame. About the gap between who you are on a film set and who you are when the last person has gone home and the lights are off. Van Damme, by finally breaking his silence, made a request of his audience. He asked them to set down the comfortable myth and pick up something messier, something more difficult to hold, something more honest. Not everyone is ready for that trade. But the reason those interviews reached people the way they did, the reason they still circulate, still get shared, still prompt something in the people who watch them, is not nostalgia. It's recognition. The feelings Van Damme described, the need to be seen as enough, the exhaustion of measuring yourself against someone else's version of success. The slow and unglamorous work of making peace with the actual life you lived rather than the life you once imagined. Those are not the feelings of a movie star. Those are the feelings of anyone who has ever looked at someone else's life and felt quietly diminished by the comparison. Chuck Norris has never publicly answered in kind. His silence on the deeper questions has remained as complete and consistent as everything else about his public persona. And perhaps that silence is its own kind of philosophy, not a refusal to feel, but a different belief about what belongs to the world and what belongs only to yourself. There is no wrong answer there are only different choices. But what Van Damme chose, to sit in the discomfort of being truly seen, to let the real story surface even knowing how it would land, has changed the way a significant number of people carry him now. Not as a faded star, not as a cautionary tale wheeled out to make a point about excess, but as someone who walked through real darkness and came back with something genuine to offer. That kind of legacy is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a premiere or a press tour or a poster on a wall. It lives in the words he finally allowed himself to say. In the silence he finally had the courage to break. And maybe, when you look at everything both men built and everything it cost them, maybe that is the most powerful thing either of them ever did. Not the kicks, not the films, not the cultural mythology that a whole generation was raised on, but the moment one of them looked directly at the camera, set down the armor, and simply told the truth. If something in this story stayed with you, if it touched something you recognize from your own life, take a moment with that feeling. These are men we grew up watching, and it turns out their stories are far more human than the legends we built around them ever suggested. Leave a comment below. Tell us what this era meant to you, or what surprised you most about what Van Damme had to say. And if you want more stories told this way, with honesty, with care, without noise, subscribe and stay close. The next one is already on its way.